Welcome and thank you for joining me. I am going to be taking you through the NSGP, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. If we haven't met before, my name is Simon Osmo. I'm the CEO and founder of Kingswood Security Consulting. We are a Minneapolis-based risk management consulting firm. A little bit about my history before we start. I'm a former British detective that used to focus on organised crime and terrorism. 2006, I worked with MI5 and liquid bomb terrorism plots. Emigrated here and was head of counterterrorism at Mall of America, Minnesota. And I've worked in corporate America for large companies like US Bank, Wells Fargo, Equinity Trust Company in and around risk management. So quite a breadth of different experiences. What do we do at Kingswood? We help organizations with emergency operations plans. We help organizations with conducting threat and vulnerability assessments. We support them with MSA, doing a lot of behavior-based threat assessment, master service agreements, and we do a little bit of training, but primarily on the 80-20 rule. 80% of what we do is conducting deep dive vulnerability assessments. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the NSGP program and what it is, but let me just start off by saying the next grant cycle, to get you at the very beginning, the next grant cycle is going to open in around April, May of this year. So the first best time to apply for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program was last year. The second best time is today. So you are in the right place if you are joining me on this webinar to learn about the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. So I'll tell you a little bit about my history with the NSGP, Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Around 2019, I conducted a vulnerability assessment at my church, Westwood Community Church in Excelsior, Minnesota. And from that vulnerability assessment, we used a basis to create our NSGP application. We've had over $200,000 from the NSGP, which is a FEMA grant. Quickly realized that the success of the program relies heavily on how comprehensive your vulnerability assessment is and the information that was inside. I'm going to tell you later that you can only apply for things that are inside your vulnerability assessment. Often in the nonprofit world, what happens is if you become known and good at doing something, everyone starts referring you to other people. And eventually we started to help other churches and other nonprofits to be successful. This webinar, this LinkedIn Live, YouTube Live that you're joining me for, over 4,000 people have joined and attended one of our webinars since 2021. So we're seeing year upon year, there's been an increase in awareness and knowledge for people to understand what is the NSGP. And conservatively, we only know from the true clients we've had over 4,000 people come on this webinar. We've achieved over $18 million in FEMA grant funding against the NSGP. And as a sort of rule of thumb, we generally conduct around 100 vulnerability assessments a year. And as I'm going to explain to you later, that is the basis of your application. You're going to apply for things that are identified as vulnerabilities within your assessment. So that's a little bit about what we do and how we do it. We've helped people, I think it's in over 14, 16 states. I forget the number now. Each year it increases. We've just done applications in Florida. I think Florida was one of the first times, but here you can see we've helped a nonprofit in Ohio, in North Carolina, in Georgia, here in Minnesota. And it's not just people that go on to hire us to do their grant writing for them. We've had people like you that have come through this webinar and have been successful. Brian Downer here had over $125,000 from coming on one of our webinars. Mike Lynch here in Indianapolis, he had over $200,000 just by taking action from one of these webinars. Want to start off with some really positive numbers for you. If you are a nonprofit or you know some of a nonprofit and you're intrigued as to what is the NSGP Nonprofit Security Grant Program, here is the data from FEMA for the last 2 years. 2025, I'll explain a little bit later, has been a bit of a strange year with the Trump administration. There wasn't going to be FEMA. Then FEMA stayed. There wasn't going to be grant funding. Then there was grant funding. A lot of grants for 2025 are still being accepted now in 2026. So I can't give you 2025 data. But I can give you 2023 data that 43% of people that applied were successful. And then in 2024, 48% of people that applied were successful. Now, I used ChatGPT to try and help me identify, well, how many nonprofits are out there that could be eligible for this grant. And I think ChatGPT said conservatively there was somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million. FEMA only received 7,800 applications. Yes, you heard me right. FEMA only received 7,800 applications across the entire country for this NSGP grant. There is conservatively somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million 501c3 nonprofits. Only the IRS know this true number, but to me, it sounds a conservative number, right? When I know there's over 340,000 Christian denomination churches in the US, 2.5 million for nonprofits seems about right. So again, by joining me for this live and listening to this information, you have close to a 48% chance of being successful just by taking some type of positive action. Now, I'm not a betting man. I'm not a gambler. But if I had close to 48% chance, 43% chance to go all in on the Powerball, I think I would be looking very favorable in my savings account and my banking account and say, I think we need to go into this quite a lot because the success rate is high. So just by taking positive action, you have close to a 50% chance of being successful, because right now there are so few applications, 7,800 applications across the country. So I've thrown a little bit at you already as we've started. So let's talk about, well, what is the NSGP FEMA grant, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program? Well, this was started by George Bush Jr. in 2004 as a terrorism grant, so post 9/11 to combat terrorism. In 2019, they added the words other extremist attack. Now, I have many high-profile nonprofit clients. One of them is the National Episcopal Church. They're on 4th Avenue in New York. I believe they're opposite the Israeli consulate or the Israeli embassy. I forget which one it is. I think it's the Israeli embassy in New York. New York, rich history with terrorism. The National Episcopal Church, very affirming on a lot of divisive issues, close to the Israeli embassy, high risk. Easy for them to say, right, as to why you might be high risk of terrorism. But what about the rest of us nonprofits that don't have that threat picture? Well, the great thing with this grant is that in 2019, they added the words other extremist attack. Now, when you look on LinkedIn, YouTube, and other social media platforms, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out we live in a very divisive world. You have to be incredibly careful what you say, because there's someone there willing to blow your head off for your views and opinions. We've lost the art of good debate and good conversation. But when they added the words other extremist attack, it actually made it easier for us at nonprofits and churches to be applicable or to demonstrate why we're high risk because of a lot of the theology and missions that you have. So taking the church for a moment, views on abortion, homosexuality, reproductive rights. What else have we got? Did I mention abortion? The theology as to what you believe in, two genders perhaps. There's all these issues which in today's modern world are incredibly divisive. And we've seen when Graham Thompson, forget his first name, Thompson was his last name escapes me, but for Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare here in Minnesota, no one felt that an extremist opposed to the pharmaceutical industry and the money that they're charging people for medical treatment, that someone would pursue him to New York and really assassinate him in the early hours of the morning. People used to think these things were impossible, but now these armchair warriors have moved past the armchair and they've moved to action. I've remembered his name, Brian Thompson. When you're doing things live, you often forget things. So when Brian Thompson was killed, it really showed the world how easy this can be. You need to be someone with a firearm, with some type of grudge. So the extremism became easier for non-profits to articulate why we're high risk. Let's talk a little bit about some of the funding that this grant has historically had. So in 2022, the grant had 250 million. 2023, there was 305 million. 2024, 454 million. So you can see every year it's increased. 2025, as I mentioned, was a bit of a washout, an anomaly for a year. Initially, Trump was going to disband FEMA. Then FEMA wasn't disbanded. Then all government grants were put on hold. Then all the grants came back. Then there was delays and government shut down. So I think we agree 2025 was a bit of an anomaly year. But it was only 274 million was allotted for the NSGP. Now, I suspect 2026, as we level out and normal play resumed, that those funds would increase. But in any case, bearing in mind, there was only 7,800 applications countrywide for this grant. This is still a high rewards grant, and every president, whether you're red or blue, has invested in this grant significantly since it started in 2004. So let's talk about who can apply then and the classification. So there's two classifications to this grant. One is called an urban area, and one is called the S Security Initiative. So FEMA designate, I think it's currently in their 30s, it changes each year, but FEMA designate states and cities as being high risk. Now, this used to make a really big difference. So those states that are designated as high risk by FEMA and Homeland Security, they are called urban areas, which means that you are automatically able to apply for up to $200,000. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. Excuse me. The NSGPS used to be for cities and states that weren't designated as being high risk by FEMA and Homeland Security. Now, going back historically, there used to be a big divide between the urban area and the security, but the urban area used to be $150,000, and a lot of states would award like $50,000, $60,000, predominantly around the sort of $50,000 area. What seems to happen now is that everyone's really using the same pool of funds. So the urban area and security, the urban area really means that you're using federal funds, and the NSGPS is often now state funds, but the amounts generally seem to be the same. So if you're in an urban area right now, you can apply for up to $200,000, and a lot of NSGPS state grants are also allowing up to $200,000. Ultimately, I believe those funds have come from the federal government as well. They've come from FEMA. They're just issued under a different pool. Same application you'll complete, different pool of funds. Why is it important to know this? Because once you put in your application, it's really important that the person reviewing your application, commonly known as the SAA, the State Administrative Agency, that they will have a slightly different application process for an NSGPS compared to an NSGP UA, because they need to know where the funds are going. So it's really important to make sure you know what classification are. If you want to know, I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are in an urban area. If you want to know if you're in an urban area or you're not, if you Google FEMA Notice of Intended Funding Opportunity, commonly called the NOFO, within that document, type in 2025, and 2026 isn't out yet, type in 2025, you will see in there if you are an urban area or if you are a security initiative. As I mentioned, in today's world, there's not too much difference in the money that you can ask for. It's a different tick on the box on the form. Some SAAs, state administrative agencies, are really sensitive about making sure you select the right one. I don't want your application to be invalid. So the first thing you need to do is identify which classification you are in. Are you an urban area, your security? initiative. You're going to find that by Googling NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, NSGP grant, FEMA. You will see it. You're going to read in there, and it will tell you which application you'll need to submit as to whether you're in an urban area or you're in the security initiative. Okay. So who can apply? There's a lot of people out there that give bad advice or poor advice, you might say, for me. And they'll say, if you're a nonprofit, you're eligible for this grant. I would disagree, because here's what FEMA say. To be eligible for this grant, you must have 501c3 designation with the IRS. I believe, if it's right, what I've got on the screen here, it's the 501A IRS tax code that you need to be a 501c3 nonprofit. So there's different definitions between nonprofits, but for this grant, you must be designated that as the IRS tax code to be applicable. I've had only one church in California that came to me, and they weren't a 501c3 nonprofit. Not too sure why, because they get so many tax breaks on property taxes, on pastoral income, and just there's a whole host of benefits that come from having seizure of the land and know that you're a 501c3. So they were trying to backpedal and become a 501c3. But for this grant, you must be a 501c3 under the IRS tax code. So I touched on this briefly, but let's make sure that this is super clear. How much can you apply for under the FEMA NSGP Nonprofit Security Grant Program? So if you, I'm going to give you an example. If you are watching this and you are a church and you have 4 locations, FEMA and your state, whatever state you're in, I'm going to use Minnesota, that's where I am as an example. The state of Minnesota will allow me to put 3 applications in for $200,000 each, capped at a maximum of $600,000. That remaining church, remember I said we had 4, that remaining church, if you wanted to, we could go back the following year and we could do a new application for that 4th building. If you are a nonprofit that has 2 buildings, most SAAs, state administrative agency, most SAAs, they class location to be street address, i.e. you have a different street address. So if you are a nonprofit that operates out of 2 buildings, I'm going to use Minnesota again as an example. You're a nonprofit in Minnesota, you have 2 locations, different street address. You can then submit 2 applications for $200,000 each at those locations. So you could apply for a maximum of $400,000. Added with the fact that in 2024, FEMA only received 7,800 applications, 43% in 2023, 48% in 2024 was successful. You can see why this grant is high reward. It's becoming more common, it's becoming more well known, but the rewards are still high. Now, as I mentioned, as I mentioned, how I got into this with my own church is because we conduct vulnerability assessments. The vulnerability assessment is the heartbeat of your application. Anything that you apply for must be identified as a vulnerability within your vulnerability assessment, and you need 1 vulnerability assessment per location. So the example that I gave, that the 4 church in Minnesota that want to apply for this grant, each different location would submit its own application, and each application would submit their own vulnerability assessment. The nonprofit example I gave, where they've got 2 locations, each of those locations must have a vulnerability assessment completed to be eligible, but the rewards can be high. $200,000 per location, maximum of 3. This is per year, and then a 43 and 48% chance of being successful. So if you are 1 nonprofit, 1 church, to make this super clear, you have a vulnerability assessment completed, you can apply for $200,000 at that location. So what else do you need to know about this grant? Well, this is a reimbursement program. So what does that mean? So it means that you must first spend your money and then be reimbursed. So the first thing I want to say to you is this is for new security measures. So you can't be engaging in a contract right now with Kingswood Technologies and saying, okay, we're going to do the access control, we're going to do the surveillance cameras, we're going to apply for this grant and be reimbursed. It doesn't work like that. Only when you've been accepted into the program and your state have said to you, Simon, your church has been successful, only then will they then reimburse the funds. So this is for new security measures. So you can't go back. If you're spending money now, these won't be reimbursed. They'll only reimburse going forward once you've been accepted into the program. For non-profits, I've only come across one non-profit before where they weren't reimbursed, which is often a big question. If we spend the money, we're going to be reimbursed. But at the time you've been accepted into the program, which means you've been successful, FEMA have already given your state the funds. The only time I've seen someone be unsuccessful is when they spent the funds in different area. I think it was a pastor that said, we need new audio visual for our worship center. We need new lighting. Simon's got this grant. Let's use the money there and be reimbursed. They want to try and get their lighting and audiovisual equipment be reimbursed. And it was a quick by the state. No, that's not where you said you're going to spend the money. This is a security grant. So I haven't come across in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications we've done, worked in many different states. I haven't come across many states that haven't been flexible and malleable post the grant. That's if you say you apply for access control, you apply for the grant, you get accepted into the program, then you want to resequence. It's actually, we asked for access control, but I think maybe mass notification is more important, or an emergency operations plan. Most states are willing to work with you. So don't go into it thinking we can change, but it is possible to change, as a lot of the states do realize that priorities often change. But this is a reimbursement program. You will spend your church funds once you've been accepted into the program. Then once you've been accepted into the program, you will then have the funds reimbursed. It will not reimburse anything prior to them saying you've been accepted into the program. So let's talk a bit now about who you applied to. So you've heard me say this name a couple of times, the SAA, the State Administrative Agency. If you want to try and find out who your SAA is, because this is a person you're going to apply to, really important that you build a relationship, you get to know who they are. The SAA, Google State Administrative Agency, NSGP grant, and the list will come up. You can find who your state is, and then you can reach out to them and say, hey, I've just heard about this NSGP grant, was on this webinar. It sounds like it might be something my nonprofit is interested in applying for. Can you share any information that you have? Can I get on your mailing list? XYZ, whatever questions you might have. Build that relationship early, because you are going to apply to them, the SAA. Now, some states, I think we just had this in Florida, which was an uploaded form. We had this in, I think, Michigan was also an uploaded form, and Texas have a bit of a pre-application in a grants form. Most states are still using a paper email PDF, as horrible antiquated form, but most states are still using an emailed fillable PDF application, which will submit to your SAA, your State Administrative Agency. Like I said, there's at least Florida, Michigan, Texas that has a slightly different system. I think over the next couple of years, we may see some changes to this program in that more states will start doing an electronic form. The good thing about this program is that each state can run their program differently. The bad thing about this program is that each state can run their program differently. So some states can decide to do a fillable PDF. Some states can determine that they're not going to do that and that you will go to a portal to upload. That is a question as you build a relationship with the SAA, they are the gatekeeper, is to ask them. And so I'm interested in applying for the grant. What does the application look like so you know what you are doing? Is it going to be an email fillable PDF, or is it some type of online form that you'll do on your state's website or grant statement? But the important thing here is to identify who is your state administrative agency. Search that NSGP grant. You will find it on Google. They'll have their name, their email address, and cell number. They are a government worker, so they can be hard to track down, but stick with it. 7,000 applications, 7,800 applications in 2024. It's not a great deal. 48% was successful, high reward. Follow through, take action, find out who your SAA is, and ask any questions about the grant. So let's talk a little bit now about, well, when do you apply? So what I'm going to show, or what you're seeing here on the screen, is May 18th, 2023, June 24th, 2024, the fall of 2025, some states are still open, and then in 2026 is going to be April, May, we anticipate to be open. Why am I showing you these dates? Well, FEMA have a federal deadline when your state must submit the application to them. Your state needs to get all the applications. They need to naturally, of course, grade them, work out which ones they're going to put forward, and they need time to do that. So what I often tell people is ignore the federal deadline, because that is your state. You need to make sure that you know your state deadline so you can submit your application in advance. So the May 18th deadline, 2023 federal, more than likely states might have said the end of April, beginning of May, because they need to review all their applications. The federal deadline of June 2024 most probably meant that in around the end of May, the first week in June, the SAAs in your state were closing down their deadlines because they needed to review applications and work out which ones they were going to put forward. So if you remember anything about the date to apply, I've had a few people that often get caught out by this. They're tracking the wrong date. The date to track, you'll ask your SAA this when you get on their mailing list. The date to track is the state deadline, not the federal deadline. If your state gets 100, 200 applications, they have to grade those, determine which ones they're going to put forward, and they have to do that before the federal deadline. So they will have this 2 or 3 week buffer where they can do this. Also super important, my screen just frozen. My screen is frozen. Let's see if I can bring it back. No, my screen's frozen, so I'm going to turn my camera off. Let's go to here. It's super important that you make sure you're tracking the right dates. Your SAA is going to be the person that is going to help you there, know which date you need to be aware of. So the next thing I want to look at then is, well, what's the timeline of these applications? So if you say, Simon, we're in need right now of access control, of cameras, of training, whatever it might be, I'm going to say to you, the NSGP might not be the grant for those services. If you can say, well, Simon, we need grant funding, we can afford to give it 6-7 months to find out if we can have these things paid before we take action ourselves, then I'm going to say, great, this is the grant for you. The reason being, there's quite a long lead time. So what we're seeing here right now is in the spring is often when the application opens, which is April, May-ish time. The summer is when the state is going to review your application and all the scores. In the fall is when they're going to notify nonprofits, have you been successful? And then in the winter is when you would spend the grant dollars. So as an example, you apply in April. In June, July, the SAA is going to grade your applications, notify which ones they're going to send forward to FEMA. In the fall, September, October, November, they're going to tell you, Simon, Westwood Church has been successful. Congratulations. You're going to start spending that money in the winter, January, February of 2027. So if you're saying, Simon, well, I need things right now for my services, this probably isn't the grant for you. But if you can afford to wait, here is the timeline. Apply in the spring. The state will review the application in the summer. In the fall, they will tell those non-profits that have been successful. And in the winter is when you're going to spend the grant dollars. This is a 7 to 8 month leeway. But remember, 7,800 applications, 48% of people that apply in 2024 were successful. Now, if you feel that this grant might be something that you have an interest in applying, but you're thinking it might sound a bit too complex for you, we have a course, which is a 3.5-hour course, which goes step by step through the application. If you scan the QR code, which you can see on the screen, that'll take you straight through to our step-by-step guide in how to apply for the NSGP. It is around 3.5 hours long, and I cover up the entire application process. There are modules broken down into simple chunks, 5, 10, 15-minute lessons. But again, it's going to walk you through the entire NSGP process. If that is of interest to you, you can scan that QR code and it will lead you through to that course. So now let's talk a little bit about, well, what are some of those things that you can apply for on the NSG? So most common are the things in gold. So people will apply for having my organization help them write emergency operations plans, having surveillance systems installed, having access control installed, having 3M window film or bullet resistant materials put on their glass or windows. These are the most common, but there is a list that they call the AEL, the approved equipment list. There's most probably 50, 60 items on there. These are the most common. You can go to the AEL approved equipment list. And again, you can just Google NSGP grant AEL list and it'll come up. But pretty much, if you can imagine it, it'll be on the list for things to apply for. Now, let's talk about some of the things that you can't apply for, which they don't like. So it can't be used for hiring of police officers. It can't be used for organizational operational expenses. I sort of covered this before about the pastor that wanted to use the funds for lighting at the church, for redoing their worship center. It can't be used for any of that. And they really don't like weapons training, license plate readers, and cameras for facial recognition. Now, this is interesting, right? Because this started as being a terrorism grant and then moved on to extremism. License plate readers and facial recognition are great ways to be able to detect assailants, particularly transient crime and organized crime. But for some reason, they're prohibited. They're not on the list. If there is something that you see that you like, that you think that you might want to apply for, it is worth reaching out to your SAA and asking them the direct question. They are the gatekeeper. They are the person who's going to review your application. So I would just reach out to them. You can be as transparent as you need to be. We're interested in having someone come and do firearms tactics training. Would this be permissible under the grant? Most probably they're going to say no, weapons training is not, but they're the person who's going to grade your application. So rather than try and push something through thinking, I hope Simon misses this, it's better to be transparent with your SAA, tell them the question and say, would this be included? But as I mentioned, if you go to the AEL approved equipment list, you will see pretty much everything that you're entitled to apply for. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is a term called supplanting. So, what does supplanting mean? Well, the spirit of the application is that these are for new security measures, not to replace what you already have. So a lot of nonprofits come to me and say, well, Simon, we've got an old system. It's recording to VHS, it's recording to a box in a corridor. The cameras are terrible. Is this going to be considered supplanting like for like? So FEMA does not allow supplanting. Applying for security measures that are already in place or that you're actively engaging in, i.e., we've just signed a contract with X company, we'll now put it on hold. However, we're not talking about security measures that you already have. Most of the stuff that I imagine you have, if you're a nonprofit on this webinar, most probably you have an antiquated surveillance system. You have access control that either doesn't work or which is aged. You have poor lighting in and around your building. You don't have an emergency operations plan. You've got a framework of it. Most of these things are going to be new. You're not swapping out like for like. No professional is going to say you're swapping like for like by adjusting your surveillance cameras. They're going to say, Simon, you're recording to VHS, you're recording to this box. This camera doesn't work. It's ineffective. It's in the wrong location. So most of the things you're asking for are going to be considered new areas. So supplanting, the spirit of this application is that this is for new security measures, but it's worth asking your SAA if you're unsure. Remember, they are the gatekeeper, so don't be too concerned about reaching out to them and saying, would this be considered new? Most of the things that you have, I'm pretty sure, are old. They need to be replaced. These would be considered complete upgrades as opposed to swapping out like for like. But the spirit is supposed to be for new security measures. So let's talk for a moment then as to, well, how does FEMA and the state make awards? So the SAA, the state administrative agency, they will grade your application. They only submit the investment justification form to FEMA after reviewing all your documents. So you will submit a vulnerability assessment for each location that you are applying for and the investment justification, which is really the application form. That's just the name for it. They will review, they will grade your application, and then they will determine which ones they're going to send to FEMA. Now, when I said to you, it's really important to get to know your SAA, it's for these reasons. They are the gatekeeper. They will play down their role. It's not our role to grade these applications. We send them all off to FEMA. If someone's unsuccessful and complains or reaches out and say, it wasn't me, I just did a basic formula online. But here's the reality of it. Here's the common sense approach. If the SAA is grading all these applications, they are only going to put a percentage through to FEMA. So there must be a scoring for them to work out what they're going to put forward, what they don't. And they must be doing this because if they get 1,000 applications, they're not just going to send all these applications to FEMA and saying, we've collated all this stuff for you. By the way, here's the stuff. Go about and do your grades. It's common sense, right? I've actually got guidance from FEMA to say their role is to adjudicate the SAA's process. Their role isn't necessarily to intervene in the scoring. Where is it? Somewhere in the middle. I believe the SAAs score the applications. I believe FEMA reviews those applications. They may run their own risk matrix over the top and then determine where the funds are going to go. But don't let the SAA say to you, we just put forward all the applications. They are responsible for grading applications. And the common sense approach is if they get 200, they're not going to put all 200 forward. There's got to be a way for them to score them. Remember, unlike the IRS, your state doesn't have a big stick to beat you with or to enforce the rules. So it's really important that if you make statements or claims in your applications, that you give them the information. It could be you're a private school and you're talking about mass shootings. It could be that you give them information from the Violence Prevention Project to talk about data for school shootings. If you're a house of worship, it could be that you're going to give them news articles of a mass shooting which has occurred at a church. If you're a non-profit that deals with women that are involved in domestic violence, you're going to give them information which talks about the risk of domestic violence. So really important to remember that yes, this grant is for terrorism and extremism, but when you're submitting the application and the state is going to review and grade it, remember they don't have a big stick like the IRS. They have to grade you on what you tell them, what information you provide. So it's super important that as you're looking at the threats, risks to your organization, that you're providing them context as to what that is, because it's highly unlikely your SAA is going to go online and research all this. If they have 50 to 60 applications, you've got to terrorism. Sorry, you've got to tell them. And how does the state make the awards? It awards funds given to those that are at high risk of terrorism or extremism. Issues in your parking lot, drug dealing, loitering, criminal damage, theft, burglary. Yes, those things matter if you've been the victim of crime. However, this grant is for two things only. Those non-profits that are high risk of terrorism or extremism, so stick there. You do not need to have been the victim of terrorism. You do not need to have been the victim of extremism, but you've got to educate your SAA. Why would your organization be of high risk? Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about then is the application. So how is the application scored? So there are 40 points, and if someone has been successful before, FEMA asks the state to sort of change their score in two ways. They can either deduct them 15 points, so their score is then maxed out at 25, or they can give bonus points to organizations that haven't been successful before. So I'm not talking about just applying, I'm talking about if you've been given funds. So the score is out of 40. If an application has been made before and been successful, FEMA says either give bonus points to those that haven't been successful or take points away from the one that has. What is FEMA saying here? Really, they're saying that this is for new security measures. So if someone's been successful, there is a way that you're being penalized. However, remember that data, 2024, 7,800 applications, 48% of those were successful. The SAA can only make awards, they can only give funding to those that apply. So if there's only 50, 60, 70 applications in your state and half of those have applied before, well, shame on non-profits that haven't. The SAA has to make the awards and funds somewhere. So really important to remember that. Even though someone might have been penalized, with the application rates so low, it can still count in your favor. So if you're joining this webinar just to learn a little bit more and you've already been successful, my advice to you would be apply again. It's well worth applying again because you never know how the SAA is going to grade the applications. But the application information itself is not scored. Background information has 5 points. You should be getting 5 points there, right, for the background points to the organization. What I've identified is the two sections here, the risk section and the investment justification. The risk, why is Westwood Community Church in Excelsior, Minnesota, why is it at high risk of terrorism or extremism? What does our pastor say, do? What's our theology, our religious beliefs? What activities and non-profits use our facility? Why might, it's hard for a terrorist, but why might an extremist come to our church? The game is often won or lost in these two areas. 24 points out of the 14. The risk section is super important. If you are a non-profit and you have a grant writer on staff, be very hesitant when someone says we've got a grant writer. This grant is for two things only: organizations that are at high risk of terrorism or extremism, the weight, how good your vulnerability assessment matters, and how you can articulate the risk matters. Super important. 15 points. This is where the game is won or lost. And then the investment justification section. This is where you're going to explain what it is you're asking for, why it's going to help your nonprofit tackle extremism or terrorism, and then the project milestone. How are you going to run the project? Who's going to be in charge of the project? And what is the impact, right? So if we give you the funds, what is going to be the impact of introducing these new security measures? Just want to reiterate before we go on to the next slide. The game is often won or lost on those two sections. Risk and investment justification are 24 points out of the 40 points. I'm not saying, I don't want to, if you're a grant writer on this webinar, I'm not saying this is you. But there is a high percentage of nonprofits and churches that I work with that say we have a grant writer, and then when they're unsuccessful, they say, well, what happened, Simon? We've got one of the best grant writers out there, and I read the application. It was all about they sing Kumbaya, they sit around the campfires, we believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and here's our biblical nonsense. They do not care. I'm a Christian of 40 plus years. They do not care. This application is for two things, people. It's for terrorism and extremism. Make sure you've got the right person who's writing your grant application, someone who understands risk and vulnerabilities, and you've had a professional comprehensive vulnerability assessment. In the eyes of the Lord, your faith matters. Yes, in this application, this isn't a church grant. This is a non-profit grant. Really, really important. Those are the two areas I can't stress enough. The game is won or lost here, people. The game is won or lost here. So the last thing then is about the vulnerability assessment. So if you are joining me for the first time and a lot of this stuff is new, you can even be saying, well, Simon, you've explained the vulnerability assessment is the heartbeat of the application. The vulnerability assessment is needed to be able to apply, and you need one per location. So if you're a multi-site and you're thinking I might apply for 2 or 3 locations, you need a vulnerability assessment each location. What does the vulnerability assessment really look like? It's an outward projective of your risk and vulnerabilities, most often looking at these different areas. The first one is looking at the administrative side of your program. Threat assessment team, business continuity, workplace violence prevention, how you're training medicals, how you're doing background checks, incident reporting. Anything that is administrative in your program would come under this section. The next event looks at your physical security, and at Kingswood Security Consulting, what we do is we go on site and do a comprehensive review. So your physical security, your windows, doors, locks, the hardware you're using, the direction of foot traffic around your building, the perimeter fencing that you might have, how people get in and out of your building. Anything to do with the physical security is next. And then finally, what our vulnerability assessment includes is the security technology. Cameras, access control, what else do you have? Mass communication, PA systems. You might put lighting under technology because it's sort of a technology, but anything that you can imagine on the technology side, radios, social media monitoring will get reviewed. The advantage of having a professional look at it is you've got their years of experience and a wide, holistic view of your program. They find all the vulnerabilities, then they give you the remediation strategies. So, as an example, on physical security, you don't have any standoff measures. Here's the recommendation of what you need to have standoff measures. You don't have cameras at your location, or you have insufficient cameras. Here's where the cameras should be placed. Here is some guidance as to what it looks like. So a vulnerability assessment by nature is a document where you feel very vulnerable because all your administrative vulnerabilities are identified. all your physical security vulnerabilities are identified, and all your security technology vulnerabilities are identified. Then they give you the remediation strategies. It's those remediation strategies that are going to form the basis of your application. So remember, you can only apply for things that are inside your vulnerability assessment. So it could be that you don't have cameras, the vulnerability assessment identified that you need an enhanced surveillance system. So you're asking for $100,000 to have a new surveillance system across your school, across your nonprofit, across your church. It is the heartbeat of the application. It's the one thing the SAA is going to go to review and grade. Super important. The Secure Community Network, our Jewish brothers and sisters, they recommend, as do FEMA, that you have one conducted by a security professional. And me, as a security professional that submitted hundreds of these applications successfully in multiple states, I would say it is a true metric of success. Even outside of the grant, if you've never had a vulnerability assessment completed in your nonprofit, it'll give you the strategy to know where to start. Many clients come to us and they don't know where to start, or they're doing things in the wrong order, which aren't mitigating the biggest risks, or they're spending money on expensive things like access control, and then we go on site and then someone's propping all the doors open. That $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 on access control was valid and was needed. However, it's useless because some person is propping the doors open. The first thing we should have tackled was a security culture. So it's really important to have a comprehensive vulnerability assessment. The SCN, FEMA recommend a one conducted by a security professional. I would also agree it's a strong metric of success. It's the one document that your SAA is going to go to. Now, if you have joined me today and everything that I said has sparked your interest in some way, if you scan this QR code, it goes through to an online calendar where you can have a free consultation with me. It doesn't cost anything. I'm just going to my cameras work and it's playing up now for some